All right, let's do it. Today we're diving into the world of Empedocles, a Greek philosopher who was asking some seriously big questions about the universe, like 2,500 years ago. And guess what? We're still trying to figure out the answers today. I mean, the guy was way ahead of his time.
It's funny, what makes Empedocles so fascinating is that he wasn't just a philosopher, he was also a poet and a physician.
Mm.
He was really trying to grasp the entire universe, connect the physical world to our very existence.
Okay, so a philosopher, poet, and a physician. Whoa, that's like a triple threat.
Mhm.
I'm sensing his work wasn't exactly beach reading, right?
Haha, not quite. He wrote in verse, which was pretty common back then, but yeah, it does make it a little tricky for us to really unpack his ideas today.
Yeah, I can imagine. So let's
Yeah.
break it down. What were some of Empedocles' big, core ideas?
Well, Empedocles believed that everything in the universe, everything, is made up of four fundamental elements. He called them roots: earth, air, fire, and water. And he saw these roots as always in motion, constantly, driven by these two opposing forces, love and strife.
Love and strife. It sounds like the title of a movie or something. How did these forces play out in his view?
Okay, picture it like a giant cosmic dance,
Yeah.
right? Love brings everything together, creates unity and harmony, while strife, on the other hand, pulls things apart, leading to change and separation. And this constant back and forth between these two forces, love and strife, that's what creates the dynamism of the cosmos, according to Empedocles.
So it's not that the elements like earth, air, fire, and water are actually changing. It's how they're being combined and separated by these forces that creates everything we see and experience. That's pretty amazing insight when you think about it.
Totally. And Empedocles took this idea even further, envisioning a universe that goes through these cycles of creation and destruction.
Cycles of creation and destruction. Okay, now I'm really hooked. Tell me more.
Okay, imagine this. When love is in total control, all the elements are perfectly mixed together in what he called the sphere of unity. But strife eventually comes in, disrupts all this perfect harmony and throws the elements into motion. And this separation, that's what gives rise to the cosmos as we know it.
So everything starts from this unified state and then expands outward. And it makes me think of the Big Bang Theory in modern science.
It's pretty incredible, isn't it? How an idea from 2,500 years ago can still resonate with our current scientific understanding.
It really is. So what happens next in this cosmic dance?
Well, as strife continues to be in charge, the elements get separated even more and more until eventually the cosmos falls apart. But then love starts to come back, drawing the elements back together until finally they reach another sphere of unity.
So it's almost like a cosmic breath, right? Expanding and contracting, driven by love and strife.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And what's even cooler is that Empedocles believed this whole cycle didn't just apply to the universe as a whole, but it also applied to how life itself, how it begins and ends.
Hold on. So he had ideas about the origin of life too. This guy was busy.
Oh, yeah, super busy. And his thoughts on how life started, they're wild. Imagine a time when strife was in charge and body parts were just floating around by themselves. Eyes without faces, limbs without bodies. It's like something out of a strange, dreamlike painting.
Okay, that is an image I won't be forgetting anytime soon.
Right.
So how did these random parts, how did he think they became creatures like we see today?
Well, as love started to gain some influence, these separated parts started to randomly join together. And sometimes, well, they formed some pretty bizarre creatures, like ox-headed men, man-headed oxen, things like that.
Whoa. It's like he was imagining some kind of early version of evolution where you get all these weird combinations.
Yeah, exactly. And through a process that sounds a bit like natural selection, the creatures that worked better, they eventually came out on top, including humans, of course.
So he was already kind of thinking about the idea that not every combination of body parts is going to work out right,
Yeah,
that there's something that selects for the forms that function better.
you got it. And remember, he came up with all this centuries before Darwin.
That's mind-blowing. It really makes you wonder what he could have figured out if he had access to all the tools and knowledge we have today. But before we get too carried away with that, I'm curious about something. We've been talking about love and strife as these kind of abstract forces. Did Empedocles connect them to anything concrete in the physical world?
He did. Empedocles thought blood, especially the blood around the heart, was super important for us to be able to think and perceive the world.
Oh, wow. So for him, blood wasn't just about keeping us alive. It was the center of consciousness itself.
Exactly. And he went even further, suggesting that the balance of, remember those four elements? Well, the balance of those elements in our blood actually influenced our personalities, made us more intelligent, lazy, or passionate.
So he was trying to connect, like, our physical makeup to our mental and emotional states. That's a really holistic view of the human experience.
Absolutely. And this idea of like everything being connected is like a core part of Empedocles' whole philosophy. He believed that everything in the universe is linked, not just physically, but on a spiritual level too.
Okay, now we're getting into some deep stuff. So he wasn't just a scientist and philosopher, he was also into spirituality and ethics.
That's right. And that's where his other big work comes in, the purifications.
Okay, I'm ready for this. But before we dive into that, can you give me a little sneak peek of what it's all about?
Well, in the Purifications, Empedocles explores the idea of reincarnation, or the transmigration of souls. He thought that our souls, which he called demons, are immortal, and they go through this cycle of rebirth, living as plants, animals, and humans.
Demons? That sounds kind of spooky. Were these like evil spirits?
Not really, no. For Empedocles, demons were more like divine sparks, pieces of that original sphere of unity that got scattered and now have to go through this cycle of rebirth.
Ah, okay, so not evil, but like parts of something bigger trying to find their way back to the source.
Exactly. And this soul's journey, this reincarnation cycle, Empedocles saw it as a process of purification. By living ethically, striving for that unity with love, we can slowly cleanse our souls from the influence of strife and finally break free from the cycle of rebirth and rejoin the divine.
So it's like a cosmic quest for enlightenment. That's heavy stuff. I'm definitely eager to learn more about how he imagined all this working.
Well, that's where we'll pick up in the next part of our deep dive.
Awesome. I'm already blown away by what we've uncovered. It's amazing how Empedocles was wrestling with these huge questions about the universe, life, the meaning of existence, all that. And to think he was doing this over 2,000 years ago.
It really shows you the power of philosophical thinking, right?
Totally. All right, listeners, stay tuned. We're going to dive even deeper into the mind of this incredible thinker.
Welcome back. Let's jump right back into Empedocles, specifically his other major work, The Purifications. Remember, this is where he really digs into ethics and this idea of like the transmigration of souls, reincarnation.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier how Empedocles believed that our souls, these daemons, go through all these different lives, plants, animals, humans. What was the point of all that, like soul hopping in his view?
Well, he saw it as like this big purification process. Like by living an ethical life and really striving for that connection with love, we can slowly like cleanse our souls from all the negative influence of strife, and eventually we can actually break free from this whole cycle of rebirth and like rejoin the divine.
Okay, so it's not just randomly bouncing between bodies. There's like a purpose to it, right? Kind of
Right.
like a path towards like enlightenment.
That's a really good way to put it. And for Empedocles, ethical living, that was huge in this whole purification thing.
So what did ethical living look like for Empedocles? Was it like following set of rules?
Well, he was a huge advocate for vegetarianism. He thought killing and eating animals was a big no-no, like seriously polluted the soul. He even went as far as comparing animal sacrifice to human sacrifice.
Oh, wow. So no steak dinners for Empedocles, huh? But seriously, that's a pretty radical idea for back then. It sounds like he was really emphasizing how all living things are, like, connected.
Exactly. He believed all life was sacred and interconnected, a reflection of that original sphere of unity we talked about earlier. He even thought eating beans and bay leaves was bad, though we're not really sure why now.
Yeah. Well, nobody's perfect, right?
Hmm.
And maybe he just had a bad experience with some, like, bean dip at a party or
Yeah.
something. But all jokes aside, it sounds like he was all about living in a way that, like, did the least harm and promoted harmony. Do you see any similarities with, like, other philosophical or religious traditions?
Oh, tons. These ideas about karma and reincarnation, they pop up in Eastern philosophies too, like Hinduism and Buddhism. It seems like it's something humans have always wondered about. What are we doing here and what's it all about?
Yeah, definitely. So how did Empedocles imagine this whole purification process actually, like, playing out? What happens to the demon, as it goes through these different lives?
He believed each lifetime, with all its ups and downs, its joys and sorrows, everything contributed to this purification process. It's like this gradual uncovering of how everything's connected.
So each lifetime. is like a lesson learned, like a piece of the puzzle of like
Yeah.
understanding the universe.
Yeah, exactly. And he even like laid out this hierarchy of incarnations, almost like a ladder leading up towards enlightenment. Plants at the bottom, then animals, and humans at the very top. And even among humans, he saw seers, poets, doctors, and leaders as like the most purified, the closest to actually becoming gods.
Hold on, did you say becoming gods? Like he thought humans could actually become gods.
Yeah. He believed that if you kept purifying yourself, eventually your demon could escape this whole reincarnation cycle and actually rejoin the immortal gods. In fact, he even claimed that he had reached this godlike state himself.
Whoa, that's a pretty bold statement. It's incredible how he brought together all these ideas about like nature, the cosmos, and the soul. It wasn't just separate theories. It was like he was building this huge vision of existence, connecting the physical and the spiritual in this really profound way.
Totally. And that's part of what makes him so relevant today. You know, in a world where things often feel so chaotic and disconnected, he reminds us that there's this underlying unity to it all.
It really gets you thinking. But I am curious about like his personal experiences. Did he ever say anything about his own past lives, what he had been before?
He did. There's this famous fragment where he basically says, I've already been a youth and a girl, a bush and a bird, even a fish leaping out of the sea.
Wow, that's quite the resume. It seems like he really embraced the idea that we've all experienced life in so many forms, and that ties right back to his emphasis on compassion and respect for all living things.
Absolutely. But there's another piece of his philosophy we haven't touched on yet, his theory of perception.
Oh, right. We haven't talked about how we thought we actually perceive things, make sense of the world around us.
Well, Empedocles had this really interesting idea that we perceive things through like this like a tracks-like process. He thought our senses detect elements in the world because we have those same elements inside us.
So it's like some kind of like resonance between our inner elements and the elements in the world.
Exactly. He used the example of how we see the color white. He said it's because the fire in our eyes interacts with the element of fire in objects that look white to us. Of course, we know now that's not scientifically how it works, but it shows how deeply curious he was about how our minds make sense of the world.
It's almost poetic, the idea that we perceive things through this kind of elemental kinship.
I know, right? And even though his explanation might not hold up scientifically, it highlights this idea that we're not just passively observing the universe. We're actively participating, constantly interacting with and exchanging with the elements all around us.
And that brings us right back to the cyclical nature of his universe, right? It's like just as love and strife drive that cosmic dance of creation and destruction, they're also influencing the flow of elements within us, shaping our perceptions, thoughts, and maybe even our destinies. This is also mind-blowing. But one thing I'm wondering about is like individual identity. If everything is constantly changing and being reborn, what about like our sense of self? Is there anything that, stays the same throughout all this reincarnation?
That's a question that's been bugging philosophers for like forever. Empedocles didn't really give a clear-cut answer, but he did give some pretty interesting clues.
Okay, I'm all ears. What were his thoughts on like this idea of a lasting self?
Remember how he described the demon as like a fragment of that original sphere of unity?
Yeah, like a little spark of the divine that got scattered out into the universe.
Right. So even though the daemon goes through all these transformations, living in different bodies, different lives, maybe there's like a core essence, a little spark of that original unity
Yeah.
that stays the same throughout the whole journey.
So even though our bodies and personalities change all the time, there might be a deeper part of us, an unchanging self, that stays intact.
It's possible, yeah. And it's a pretty comforting thought, right? To think that
Right.
even in the middle of all this constant change, there's a part of us that's eternal, connected to everything.
It is comforting. Maybe it's not about like building a fixed identity, but about finding that connection to the eternal part of ourselves.
Right.
We could talk about this all day, but is there anything else from his work that we should touch on?
Yeah, there's one more thing I think it's really important to remember. Empedocles wasn't just like coming up with these philosophical ideas in a vacuum. He was also really grounded in like his understanding of the natural world.
Oh, so he was kind of like a scientist at heart, using what he observed in nature to inform his philosophical thinking.
Totally. He was fascinated by things like growth and decay, the elements interacting, and the diversity of life. He wasn't just spinning abstract theories. He was really trying to figure out the world around him, find meaning in the patterns he observed. And that makes his ideas even more compelling, don't you think?
Definitely. He was a real Renaissance man, embracing both the like wonder and the logic of existence. It makes you think about how we approach knowledge today, often separating science and philosophy into these completely different things.
You hit the nail on the head. Empedocles' work is a perfect example of a more holistic way of understanding the universe. Science and philosophy, they go hand in hand, you know?
I love that. He encourages us to like appreciate the beauty of nature, but also try to understand how it all works at the same time. But speaking of understanding how things work, we talk a lot about Empedocles' ideas, but what about his actual writings?
Great question. That brings us to one of the most interesting things about him, the fact that he wrote his philosophy as poetry.
Oh, that's right. We mentioned earlier how he wrote in verse, which must have been a real challenge to figure out. Why do you think he chose poetry to, like, express these complex ideas?
Well, back then, writing in verse was a way to make philosophical teachings more, like, memorable. It gave them this air of beauty and authority, you know?
So it wasn't just about being intellectually sound. They wanted to make philosophy, like, beautiful and engaging, too.
Exactly. They understood that language had this power to move people, inspire them, you know, connect with them on an emotional level, not just an intellectual one.
Make sense? But I bet trying to figure out what he meant is like putting together a giant puzzle.
It can be. Trying to decipher ancient poetry is tough, especially when we only have fragments of the original texts. But luckily for us, we have more fragments from Empedocles than from some other pre-Socratic philosophers.
That's good to hear. So what makes Empedocles' poetic style unique? What sets him apart?
His use of imagery is amazing. He's got these vivid metaphors and similes, and they're all drawn from nature and everyday life to make these abstract ideas more like down to earth and relatable.
Can you give me an example?
Totally. Remember when we talked about zoogony, you know, the origin of life? He used this analogy of painters mixing pigments to create different colors and forms, just like love and strife combine the elements to make all these different living things.
Yeah, I remember. That's such a cool way to explain something so complex. Like, he's not just telling us his ideas, he's showing them to us, you know? He wants us to see the world through his poetic eyes.
Exactly. And all that imagery, it's not just there to sound fancy, it's key to understanding his philosophy.
It's like he turned philosophy into an art form. He's speaking to our minds and our imaginations. Do you have any favorite fragments from his work that really capture like the essence of his thinking?
I do. There's one from the Purifications that really speaks to me. There is an oracle of necessity, an ancient decree of the gods, eternal, sealed by broad oaths. Whenever by crimes, absolutely. And that message, it goes beyond any time or culture. It's about something deep within us, this desire for meaning and purpose.
This has been such a mind-opening deep dive into Empedocles. I'm so glad we did this.
Me too. Exploring his ideas has been a real privilege.
Before we wrap up, what are your thoughts on how Empedocles' philosophy applies to, our lives today? What can we learn from this ancient guy that's still relevant in the modern world?
That's a great question. You know, I think Empedocles would love to answer that himself. He was a big believer that philosophy should actually impact how we live our lives, you know, guide our actions and shape our values.
So how do we bridge that gap between ancient wisdom and modern living?
Well, one key takeaway is this idea of interconnectedness. In a world that often feels so divided, he reminds us that we're all part of a larger whole, you know, all connected by those forces of love and strife.
So it's not just about looking out for number one, but understanding our place in this like web of life and doing things that promote harmony and balance.
Exactly, and this applies to how we treat each other and how we treat the natural world. Empedocles was a real nature enthusiast. He got the whole balance of elements thing and these cycles in nature. His teachings remind us to respect the environment and live sustainably.
Yeah, that's so important now, especially with all the environmental issues we're facing.
For sure. Empedocles' philosophy gives us a great way to understand how connected we are to nature and to make choices that are good for us and the planet.
So it's not just about abstract theories, it's about putting those theories into practice.
Yep. And that leads to another important point, this idea of purification.
Right, the whole cycle of reincarnation and cleansing the soul. But how does that apply to us, like, right now?
Empedocles believed purification was this ongoing process, you know, this constant striving to be more in line with love and less influenced by strife. We might not believe in reincarnation literally, but we can still use this idea to grow personally and become more ethical.
So it's about always trying to improve ourselves, make choices that lead to more harmony and understanding, both within ourselves and with everything around us.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that we're all works in progress, always evolving.
I love that. It's like Empedocles gave us this map to living a meaningful life a path toward wisdom, compassion, and connection.
I agree. And the path might not always be smooth sailing, but it's worth it.
Well, this deep dive into the world of Empedocles has been truly eye-opening. His ideas are so rich and complex, I feel like there's something here for everyone.
I totally agree. He was a true visionary, way ahead of his time in so many ways.
And to our listener out there, we know you're a philosopher. Keep digging into Empedocles' work. His insights on reality, life, and what it means to be human are just as relevant today as they were over 2,000 years ago.
Who knows? You might even discover some new philosophical questions of your own along the way.
Absolutely, the search for wisdom never really ends. Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into the brilliant and always fascinating world of Empedocles. Thanks for joining us.
Until next time, keep those questions coming, keep searching, and keep that sense of wonder alive.
So we spent all this time with Empedocles, right? And I'm thinking his ideas, especially about balance and everything being connected, they really seem like they'd be super helpful for someone trying to make sense of the world, like, a philosopher.
Oh, totally. And it's important to remember he wasn't just a philosopher, he was also a scientist and a poet, right? So his ideas weren't just stuck in the abstract, they were grounded in what he observed and his desire to really connect with people on a gut level.
That's true. And speaking of connecting on a gut level, one of the things that really stood out to me about Empedocles was this idea that we perceive the world through this, like, attracts-like kind of process.
Yeah.
Like, what do you think a philosopher today would take away from that concept?
Well, we know from science, of course, that's not exactly how perception works, but I think it brings up some really interesting philosophical questions about how what's going on inside us, our beliefs and biases, all that might be affecting how we see the world.
It's like that idea that we don't see the world as it is, but as we are, right?
Yeah, totally. And for a philosopher, I think it really underlines the importance of being self-aware and thinking critically. Like, if you really want to understand the world objectively, you have to understand your own subjective filters.
So it's not just about understanding the world out there, it's about understanding yourself and your own mind.
Exactly. And that brings us back to Empedocles' concept of the demon, right? That spark of the divine that's inside us going through this purification process.
Mm.
I think a philosopher today might see this as a call to work on not just their intellect, but also their ethical and spiritual development.
It's like saying true wisdom isn't just about knowing a bunch of facts. It's about becoming a better, more whole human being, right?
Exactly. And that goes back to his focus on love as this unifying force. For Empedocles, love wasn't just a feeling you get. It was this huge cosmic principle that brings everything together, that creates connection and understanding.
That's such an important message, I think, especially in a world where everything feels so divided. Empedocles is reminding us that we're all connected and that to make a more harmonious world, we need to focus on love and compassion.
And he also reminds us that, the journey to understanding and wisdom, it's not always going to be a walk in the park. It's this back and forth process, like everything else, driven by love and strife.
Mm.
But it's definitely worth it.
It's been such a cool journey exploring the world of Empedocles. His ideas are so intricate, there's really something in there for everyone.
Couldn't agree more. He was a true visionary, ahead of his time in so many ways.
And to our listener out there, the philosopher we know you are, don't stop exploring Empedocles' work. His insights on reality, the universe, and what it means to be human are just as powerful today as they were thousands of years ago.
And who knows, maybe his ideas will spark some amazing new philosophical thoughts of your own.
That's a great point. The pursuit of wisdom never really ends. So, on that note, this wraps up our deep dive. Thank you for joining us as we explored the incredible world of Empedocles.
Until next time, keep asking questions, keep searching, and never lose that sense of wonder about the universe.